This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week we are going to discuss a topic that's near and dear to many of our hearts, free speech. Free speech is the lifeblood of inquiry, innovation, and open democratic dialogue. Without free speech, we cannot have a democracy. Without free speech, we cannot have a free society. And free speech is a topic that's been in the news quite a lot. It's historically a significant topic, and it's a topic that's often misunderstood. We're going to use this week's episode to discuss what free speech means, where it is threatened or imperiled today, and what we should do as individuals who care about democracy and therefore care about free speech. We're joined by a longtime friend and the person who I firmly believe has done the most important work on this topic of his generation. This is Donald Downs, the Alexander Meiklejohn Professor of Political Science Emeritus at UW-Madison. Don, it's such a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeremy.
Don's scholarship has dealt with a wide range of issues, and I encourage all of our listeners to read some of his books that I'm going to list. I'm not going to list all of his books because he's written so many, but his books deal with freedom of speech, with academic freedom, civic education. A number of his books that I particularly like and recommend include Nazis in Skokie, Freedom, Community, and the First Amendment. Another book, Restoring Free Speech and Liberty on Campus. The title tells you what it's about. And one other I'll recommend now, Arms in the University, Military Presence and the Civic Education of Non-Military Students. Don received in 2013, I believe, the National Jeane J. Kirkpatrick Academic Freedom Award for his defense of academic freedom and his defense of the freedom of thought. Don, congratulations on that award. I know it's a decade ago, but that's pretty heady stuff.
It was fun to do it, and and it was my first speech in front of that many people. I eventually spoke at a graduation at Madison, which is sort of, you can't count that, I guess. But
well, that would be a lot of people. My graduation at a university like UW-Madison was what, 10,000 people, right, or so?
Yeah, it was a winter, so it wasn't quite as big as usual. But the Cole Center was 3/4 full, 2/3 full.
Fantastic. Before we get into our conversation about free speech, of course, we have Mr. Zachary Suri's scene-setting poem. What's the title of your poem today, Zachary?
Ode to Blasphemy.
Ode to Blasphemy. That sounds like a description of our family life, Zachary. Let's hear it.
We have given the world its murderers and its blasphemers, its transgressors and the laws to be transgressed. And we have said in the state houses, liberty or death, while we have marched the slaves into the fields. It's true, we have given the world its liars and its prophets, its greatest creations and its greatest bombs. And we have said too often to our brethren, begone, when we were supposed to say, stay, my sister, and break bread with me. We have been told to love, and yet let our blood redden into hatred, that rusts like iron and tastes like steel. We have lied, we have scoffed, we have rebelled. But what is freedom without malice? What is religion without heresy?
That's really an ode to not just blasphemy, right? And an ode to radicalism of one kind or another, huh, Zachary?
Not quite. I think it's a poem about the importance of not radicalism, but disagreement, dissent.
Okay.
I think there's a difference. And it's also it's a poem about, I think, it takes this quote from Joseph Roth in one of his essays on the Yiddish theater, actually, and turns it into, I think, a statement about like what it means to be American. He's talking about what it means to be a Jewish artist. And I think in this context, it actually really fits well, sort of the American ethos of free speech and creativity and the sort of coexisting threads of American society.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense, and there's nothing.
Let me pipe in with my take on it. And
please.
Of course, poetry is always wonderful. You can never read the same poem twice, or it's not put right. When you read a poem, when you read it a second time, it's not the same poem.
Right. Yeah.
because of the different interpretations, and you're a little bit different the next time you look at it. I look at it as, in America, does fit this idea. It's life east of Eden.
Yes.
And, we are full of different impulses, and the light and the dark, we're the children of light and the children of darkness, which is a book that Reinhold Niebuhr wrote.
Yep.
And that says something about the American character. And sometimes we have a hard time finding the right balance between them, or the right tension between them. We're either naive about something, overly idealistic. Other times we're overly realistic, or whatever you want to call it. It's hard to find that sweet spot, and I think it's relevant to a lot of things. Free speech has its good elements and its bad elements, because a lot of speeches it necessarily involves ideas that, as Justice Holmes said in one of the most famous cases, it's not just freedom for ideas that you don't like; it's freedom for the thought you hate.
Yeah. What threatens that today, Don? Why does it seem that this is such a topic of our time?
Well, there's two different takes on it. I mean, one is policy and in laws and things people are doing. And the other is people's reaction to speech. And the means we have available right now to do a certain kind of censorship, not necessarily by law or by force, but by simply the kind of social bullying that turns criticism into coercion. I'll give you an example. FIRE has done surveys on universities, which is something I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, or at least about universities. And the number of students that are afraid to speak up and to say things because of the reaction that others will have, especially if it's done in a prominent way or gone online. And so social censorship, which is something John Stuart Mill was very concerned about, that Tocqueville was very concerned about, is now probably as prevalent as ever, because we have the social media and the technological means to give it strength and power. Sure. So that's something we need to talk about too. But of course, we also have issues matter. We have pressures emanating from authority figures that are always going to be part of free speech, and free speech is always an uphill battle. It has to be constantly renewed, because of people like Jonathan Rauch and Alan Dershowitz has said this, that it's always embattled, because it's freedom for the thought you hate, or it's freedom for the thought that you find really upsetting. And so there's always going to be pressures to try to silence it, or at least inhibit it.
So FIRE, which you referred to, is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which, as you referred to, Don, monitors and rates universities based on their protection of free speech. Zachary, is Don correct about the social pressures on free speech on university campuses as you've experienced it?
I think so. I think it maybe doesn't have the same silencing effect as it can have, I think, in society in general, just because I think there's so many pockets on college campuses where people of sort of minority political or political opinions can congregate, and there's so many programs designed to assist with that. I do think, though, it gets at a core question about education, which is how important is dissent and disagreement to education. I think it's vital. I think the biggest problem with a sort of social pressure on speech is that it actually limits people's ability to engage with new and different ideas, and it prevents people from learning in ways that they could. I did want to ask, though, where does this idea of free speech come from in the United States? It's a principle that a lot of us take for granted, but really isn't foundational to a lot of other democracies, countries in Europe in particular, where free speech is less of an absolute principle. Where does this sort of American version come from?
Well, that's an interesting question. And actually, the kind of free speech we know about today, with the jurisprudence behind it, is really a phenomenon of the 20th century. Though free speech as a core principle, of course, it's implied, I think, in the Declaration of Independence. Freedom of conscience, which is an important aspect of freedom of speech, or freedom of thought. And to James Madison, that was really the core of the First Amendment. That goes all the way back to our the Puritans coming here, the Pilgrims, and the Covenants, because they wanted freedom of religious conscience. And of course, in early times, sometimes that meant less freedom for people that had other religions, but it's been a struggle to make it more universal. So I would say it starts with the quest for religious freedom, and then it becomes more secularized as America becomes more secularized. To me, it's implied in the Declaration of Independence, certain and inalienable rights. And of course, then it's enshrined in the First Amendment, which was not the original Constitution. It was the appendix to the original Constitution that Madison was the author of. And then over time, we often honored it in the breach. And there's a famous line by Mark Twain that Americans enjoy the precious rights of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of conscience and the good sense never to practice them. And censorship, you go back to the original First Amendment, when it was first put to a real test was during the Sedition Acts that were passed was it 1798, I think, Jerry?
Correct. The Adams administration, yes.
Yeah, under Adams. And at that time, there was very virulent, it was the beginning of political parties, it was the beginning of factions in America at the political level. And the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans ended up kind of hating each other. It sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? And so Adams and the Federalists passed the Sedition Act along with the Alien Acts. I think there were 3 Alien Acts and 1 Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act basically made it a crime to overly criticize the government. Sort of like what's happened in England right now, or in Germany, where even insulting someone in public can land you in prison, which is really quite remarkable. And the Supreme Court never dealt with the Alien and Sedition Act, but lower courts did. And those are they had judges that were Federalists. They all upheld it. And people went to prison for publishing cartoons about Adams that were highly unflattering. And so for a long time, sedition-type laws were tolerated. And the idea of free speech as a particular liberal notion of individual right that would allow you to say highly controversial, critical things, especially of the state, didn't really develop until during World War I. And that's when the first major Supreme Court cases on the First Amendment came about. And over time, that evolved into what I call in my work the modern liberal doctrine of speech. And at the core of that are 2 things. New York Times versus Sullivan case, the one involving New York Times being found that in the famous case where they were sued for a cartoon about a general and others in the South who were trying to prevent the civil rights movement. And the New York Times said that these people were public officials. The key general in the case was a public official, and that therefore, in order to sue him, you had to meet a really high burden of proof, which is actual malice. So you either lied and you knew you were lying, or you recklessly disregarded the truth. Right. No other country in the world has a standard like that for libel suits. And in that opinion, Justice Brennan, who wrote it, who was sort of the modern godfather of the doctrine of speech, said that criticism of the government is not just tolerated under the First Amendment, it's the central meaning of the First Amendment. And he drew that statement from Alexander Meiklejohn, who I named my chair after. In his book, Political Freedom or Free Speech in Its Relationship to Self-Government, where Meiklejohn says, so Meiklejohn's theory is about self-government, democracy, which you guys are talking about. Meiklejohn says, to be afraid of an idea, any idea, is to be unfit for self-government. And Zachary mentioned earlier how crucial disagreement and engaging in dialogue, sifting and winnowing is essential to an education. It's also essential to liberal democracy and to a constitutional republic. And so we now have this whole idea of this special sphere where free speech should exist. Independent is a right that can only be contained under very extreme circumstances and special circumstances. But that was not the way it was looked at for a long time, really, until the 20th century started going on.
Right. And I think you're absolutely right, Don, that it is during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, both of which are coterminous during the 1960s, that you see in some ways the full flowering of what you've described so beautifully, which is this this world of Meiklejohn and Meiklejohn's idea of a real free flow of ideas, including hypercritical ideas.
That's right.
Expressed. Yeah.
You can even say falsehoods about the government and public officials. Next case is when it expanded the concept, as long as you didn't do so intentionally or recklessly. And that's unheard of elsewhere.
What is reckless, Don? What is reckless?
Well, it's drawn from the model penal code and criminal law that, in order to be guilty of a crime, except for there are some crimes where you can be guilty just for doing the act. That's called strict liability. But those tend to be very low-level kinds of crimes, or not even misdemeanors. To be guilty of a felony, you have to have the right mental state. And that means you either had to do it intentionally or purposely, or do it knowingly. There's a difference between purposely and knowingly. I'm not going to get into it. It's really interesting, but I think I don't think we need to do that right here. And when it comes to homicide, knowingly and purposely are pretty much the same thing. The other is recklessly, to commit a crime recklessly. And that means that you consciously knew it was highly risky to do so. So it's a conscious creation of significant risk that led to the harm that the criminal law recognizes. So it applied to the First Amendment in the Sullivan case. It would mean that either if you knew what you're saying is a lie about a public official in a way which constitutes libel, of course, then you can be sued. Or if you people around you were saying, no, you better check it out. You made no effort to check it out, and you could have, then you were reckless. Notice it's not the same thing as negligence. Mm-hmm. Negligence means that you just didn't take due care. The standard for recklessness requires a higher level of mental culpability. It's very protective.
So what if you are intentionally telling lies, using them as propaganda for your party or your candidate, attacking someone else, and you have been told they are false, and not only have you not checked, you have continued to send out that false information? How does that?
That could be potentially culpable, or subject you to a lawsuit. Now, there's another Supreme Court case, and I forget the name of it. I used to teach it. But not at great length, usually in a campaign finance situation, that someone brought a prosecutor in Ohio, I think it was, brought a case against a politician who lied while running. He just lied while running for office. He didn't carry out his promise. And now that wasn't the same thing as libeling somebody, but it was lying to get elected. Well, of course, that happens all the time. The court just said, no, every politician is going to end up being in prison. Yeah. Lying and Hannah Arendt, truth and politics are mortal enemies. And you might remember a few years ago, there was a Supreme Court case where a guy was charged with lying about his military background. Mm-hmm. And it was a stolen honor case. That's what they call the law, the stolen honor law. And Supreme Court, it was 8-1, I think. I'm really surprised that, I think it was Alito that dissented, just said, well, you can't put someone in prison or whatever, charge them with criminality for lying. And you think about someone trying to pick somebody up at a bar by bragging about what they did in the military. Well, it ends up, you weren't even in the military. You're going to send that person to prison. Mm-hmm. So the court got it right. And in another libel case in 1974, the Supreme Court said, under the First Amendment, there's no such thing as a false idea. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And by that, you can take that in a very qualified way. That because people lie all the time, ideas are often false, or even some, Newton has been proved to be partly false, right? By Einstein and modern physics. So lies are protected speech. The idea is to counter them, sift and winnow them. It's how you react to speech that matters. Unless you lie for some sort of specific person, some specific reason, like getting a job, or lying on trying to get a government grant. Then, of course, the lie is tied very closely to a specific benefit you're trying to get fraudulently. It's tied to fraud, criminal fraud. But otherwise, you have a constitutional right to lie. And I could go on forever about that.
No, this is really helpful. This is really helpful. Zachary?
How do you think it changes our politics that we have such an expansive understanding of what constitutes legal speech?
Well, it makes it a lot messier. It makes it more chaotic. And, I'm thinking even the New York Times case I mentioned earlier, and other key cases that went along with it over a handful of years that crafted the modern doctrine of speech, which, by the way, is quite different from Europe and other democracies. The court stressed the importance of conflict. One case, Cohen versus California, the draft case. The court said that the public realm is filled with verbal cacophony is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. And in the New York Times case, Brennan has famously said that the whole idea behind free speech is to encourage robust discourse. Conflict can be good. And I've written about this in other kind of contexts, also in the First Amendment context, that what you get then, though, is a distinction. This goes all the way back to Cicero. And Ortega wrote about it in his book on Concord and Liberty. There's a difference between conflict, and Machiavelli wrote about it in the Discourses, that conflict can be a sign of strength. The Supreme Court has said that because it shows that we have the strength to handle it, and it can make us even stronger. Machiavelli believed in the conflict of classes in society because it reinvigorates the society. It makes us examine the roots of our polity. But at what point does conflict turn into something more cancerous? When it's utter discord and nothing constructive comes out of it. And that's always going to be like what Melville said about the rainbow and Billy Budd. We know that red turns to orange where you never know exactly where. Mm-hmm. When does conflict become harmful enough to be problematic for a polity? Now, there are two levels there. One is that the Supreme Court over decades has crafted out key exceptions to free speech. And those are very carefully defined. They're molded by logic, constitutional logic, as well as experience in adjudication, such as, direct incitements to criminal violence are not protected as long as they're direct and they incite violence that is also likely to occur. If Mother Teresa incites violence, no one's going to really care because we're not going to take it seriously. If a hate group that is very sinister incites violence, then you got a concern, you got a problem, and a breaking of the law. So the First Amendment does have built-in exceptions, which are necessary to ordered liberty. Right? It's a key concept in our history. Liberty, we need liberty, but it needs to be ordered. And I think that's a concept that we've lost sight of in our country in a lot of different ways across the political spectrum.
So this brings Don to a very specific example I had in mind that I wanted to talk about with you, which is about protests on college campuses. Mm-hmm. So where is the line that protests should not cross? Right. And we, of course, we're debating this last year on our campuses. With
October
protests.
7th was huge.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. I mean, internationally, in terms of campus stuff, in terms of speech. Yeah. You have designated areas on campus where there are public forums. First of all, private schools are different from public schools under the law anyway, though often their policies do not make them different. First Amendment applies only to the state and to units of the state. So it applies to public schools. It does not apply to Yale, but because Yale is such a major university, Yale's policies ensure or say that they guarantee the same rights as a public university. All right. But if speech is violated, then at Yale, it's not a First Amendment violation; it's a contractual violation. And so most campuses are open areas where people may come and speak. You can regulate those by reasonable time, place, and manner regulations, but people have a right to speak there. Or in other areas in campus that are functionally the same thing as a public forum.
Do they have a right to say anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic
Yeah,
things?
this is the tough question. And the answer is, unless it's directed kind of harassment or incitement to violence against people. And after October 7th, there were several cases around the country where Jewish students were actually, or mobs were following Jewish students and being incited to do things to them, like at Cooper Union, where they had to hide in a library behind locked doors and everything. That's a crime. I'll go back to the book I wrote on Skokie. Right, that's outside the campus, but I use it because it's a nice comparison.
Yes.
The Nazis wanted to go to Skokie. The problem there was that wasn't just that out of 70,000 people, 30,000 were Jews. It was that about 1,000 or more were Holocaust survivors.
Right.
And to them, it was the nightmare reborn, at least in many cases. But the Nazis won their right to demonstrate there, though they never interesting in itself. But they never went. But they won their First Amendment right to speak there if they wanted to. That was in front of Village Hall. That wasn't in neighborhoods. That wasn't directed at anybody in particular in terms of conduct. Even though they said nasty things about Jews, it was a general statement. They wasn't face to face with individual people or anything like that. It was in the public forum. And that's where the viewpoint neutrality doctrine applies, which is the key First Amendment value. That once the right to speak has been established, the government may not pick and choose favorites based on their viewpoint. So the Nazis had the right there. Well, what about the libraries at Harvard?
Right.
That you may have read about, where the protesters filled up the whole library and they had all sorts of anti-Semitic signs and everything. That's not the same thing as sitting a 10-minute talk in front of the Village Hall at Skokie. Does it create a hostile environment? Similar to what would happen in a classroom that was laden with sexual, innuendo or what have you. Those are tough questions. And I know that the FIRE, which is the leading free speech group in America, they had discussions about, do we have a Skokie-like issue on our hands? They decided that pretty much you should apply the same principles. But so you need to look at each case and see what is actually being done and how targeted, how directed is the speech. But in principle, anti-Semitic viewpoints are protected speech. Again, depending on the circumstance. But I tell you, it's a really tough call. And I think there are cases after October 7th, if you have enough people and the thing is, Skokie was also a one and done.
Right.
Nazis were going to show up. They weren't going to be there more than 20 minutes, and they were going to go. They weren't going to come back. What happens if, like at Harvard, they're there for hours, and then the next day they're there again? What kind of rules can govern that? And usually in tough cases under the First Amendment, we haven't had to really decide definitively because it doesn't keep happening. It goes away. And so what if the Nazis would have applied to speak at Skokie every single day?
Right.
It would have busted the city budget. I'll start with that. And some schools have had that problem in recent years too, that we can't afford to keep bringing in these controversial people because of the security.
Of course.
So what I'm saying is that October 7th, which you can tell I haven't fully worked through myself, it does create situations where we really have to think twice about protecting speech there, because the harm is different from most other free speech cases because it's ongoing and everything else. And you can always find the normal exceptions to free speech, like harassment.
Sure.
And see if they apply.
Zachary?
I want to ask, how do you think universities, especially universities that are in a position to make more sort of private universities that are in a position to make sort of more expansive decisions about
Right.
these questions. How should they handle these issues? How should they discuss these issues? Are you in favor of institutional neutrality, for example?
Yeah, I think, and I realize one of the people, the AFA, who's on our academic committee, Janet Halley from Harvard, she has good arguments for why it doesn't make sense. Some of them are very practical. Like, what is an appropriate issue to be political about, what isn't. And she argues about the weaponizing of that policy. That something you don't like what somebody's saying, and you say, well, wait a minute, what if it's a department chair? You should be neutral. So, but the basic idea, you go back to the Calvin report, is, and I think this is it's a practical thing as well as a principled thing. Principled thing is the university as an institution should be open to all ideas and protect all ideas except when a clear exception to speech arises. And if the university as an institution speaks out on, say, the Dodd's decision on abortion, then that involves the university in not being neutral about ideas and how we relate to them. And there's also an empirical claim that this, in a sense, marginalizes those on campus who agree with that decision. And it contributes to kind of the one-sidedness that's already there in a lot of campus discourse. So I think in principle, the Calvin report in Chicago in 1967, which articulated this policy of institutional neutrality, the key author was Harry Calvin, who was also one of the leading architects of the modern doctrine of speech, whose doctrine of the heckler's veto and the public forum is a special liberal arena for speech. He was one of the key people behind that movement from the perspective of scholarship. And the Calvin report also praises groups organizing on campus, associations of professors, voluntary associations, speaking out publicly their views on things. That's okay. But the institution, qua institution, has a different kind of effect, and that is to be contrary to an institution that encourages all ideas. That's the basic idea. That said, instituting it can be a bit of a problem. But a lot of schools are doing it. You find, and each school is going to maybe do it in a different way. There shouldn't be any single model. And it's also strategically nice to the university, especially after October 7th, to say, we're not going to take a stand on this out of a matter of principle. So yeah, I'm for it, but I understand that you've got to really work hard on it.
Right. I mean, the allure of institutional neutrality is it takes the university out of the position of potentially picking winners and losers, right, Don?
Yeah, that's the idea. And I think there's an empirical question: does that further the one-sidedness or the orthodoxy of opinion that might exist on campus? And it does exist on many campuses. So I think it's a good idea, and but I don't think it's most policies are not perfect.
So now let's turn to another example that's prominent in our discussions of free speech: fact checking.
Yes.
Is it appropriate for Facebook or some other platform to print lies, but also indicate where they depart from truth? The most extreme example being those who claim that an election was stolen that wasn't stolen.
Yes. That's a really tough one. And I haven't thought it through all the way. I just know that a lot of fact checkers have themselves been fact checked. And it's like setting up an independent commission to study, like, say, gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm.
That might be a really good solution. I think in Iowa, it's worked out pretty well.
Yep.
From what I know. I'm not really all into that, even though I think it's a very important issue. But the first question is who gets put on the commission, and who's doing the fact checking? How neutral are they, or how capable are they? They may not be neutral, but are they able to be operationally neutral?
Right.
Because it's always going to be the case. We all have our prejudices. The question is what the role requires, and so I'm more skeptical. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to fact checkers unless it's very clear that they got a point here, and then I'll take them seriously. But I take them with a grain of salt, and the issue of censorship, like keeping Trump off of Facebook. One of my former students is Katie Harbath, who was she was the key person at Facebook that dealt with Facebook for political figures.
Wow.
And she started it within the United States, and then she helped branch it out in the world. She retired a couple of years ago. And she was a great student of mine at Wisconsin, and she did a lot of research for me, and she was involved in our free speech movement there from the student side. She was wonderful. I knew she had a huge future. And she contacted me along with other people, should Trump be taken off Facebook? And I said no, because I thought that was censorship. It goes against the grain of all First Amendment theory, et cetera. But fact checking is sort of considered a way of it's not censorship. It's simply providing more information. It's what Brandeis said, the best remedy for bad speech is good speech.
Right.
And fact checking can be that. So in principle, yeah. But like anything else, it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. First Amendment theory is premised on the idea that we're all fallible. That's the John Stuart Mill side of free speech, which is Mill did not influence the First Amendment's writing, obviously, but First Amendment advocates, everyone is steeped in respect for Mill, even if they disagree with him on certain points. He's a foundation of it, and that's Jonathan Rauch's big thing, is the fallibility principle.
Mm-hmm. But I guess with fact checking, so long as you are putting the original statement, the fact checking does not have to be perfectly objective. The point is that the fact checking is an objective effort to assess, though not perfect. Yeah, fair enough. There's, and so this is, what we all do at some level. Someone has to assess facts, right? Well, we do this as professors, judges do this, right?
That's a really important point, and I can't stress it more, Jeremy. In Rauch's book in 1993, Kindly Inquisitors, I forget the subtitle. I can't believe that. I'm getting old. But it's about the suppression of thought on campus, or not on campus, but in general. Starts by talking about the Salman Rushdie case and how the West did not rise to what his defense like it should have. It showed that the West was not serious about free speech. And I assigned that in my First Amendment class. It's the one book I assigned over the years that students did not forget. It had a huge impact on it. It changed some of their minds overnight when they read it. But it's all about the free speech side of things, and it's premised on the idea of human infallibility. No one should be when it comes to general free speech, no one should be the authority that says this is good, this is bad. You can't say what Biden did with some of the social media companies with COVID and everything. But his last major book was The Constitution of Liberty. Have you heard of that?
I have, yes.
Yes, and it's a deeper book. It's a more scholarly book. And he made the point, which I've made it over and over, is I wrote a piece that's coming out about, it's called the Free Speech Chronicles, coming out from AEI, and Rauch is in there, I think, too. And I refer to the book, and I say, once you have free speech, okay, it's great for individuals to speak their minds. That's part of the Kantian ends in themselves thing of the First Amendment and the liberal democracy. But it's also there to pursue truth. That's the utilitarian side of it. That's the Mill side.
Right.
And I'm losing my train of thought.
And how do we balance that speech with the truth pursuit?
Rauch says, but if we just have free speech for everybody, then it becomes like a smorgasbord. Yeah. Oh, this is my opinion. This is your opinion. And we all say, hey, great, you're entitled to your opinion. You got to take the next step and then respond, especially if you're pursuing truth and knowledge, and start sifting, going and using the Wisconsin idea, sifting and winnowing. Yep. We have to critically evaluate it. Some people say, if you criticize me, you're violating my free speech rights. No, you have a duty to critically respond to speech. I assume that Zach, following the tradition of his father, is really good at that.
He's very good at it, yes. He's still wrong sometimes, but he's good at it.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's the hardest thing in the world to admit you're wrong, right? That's part of the problem. And so Rauch says we need to develop critical reasoning skills to make sense of all these ideas we're being exposed to.
Yeah.
So it's a two-step process. Now, especially at a place like a university.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, academic freedom and free speech are a little bit different because you don't have a right to teach a course if you're incompetent. You don't have if you're lying in class about what you think is a truth, and you shouldn't be teaching. So the free speech ethic is vital to academic freedom. It means all ideas that are relevant to what's at hand need to be tolerated in terms of their right to be presented. But then you've got to do the critical thinking process. Right. And make sense of it. And of course, we all differ in terms of our ability to do that in different courses and things like that. Some people get A's, some people get B's, some people get C's.
Right.
So we have to, without that last process, what's the point except fulfilling an individual right to speak, which is good because a free society gives you free speech as part of human nature.
Right.
So is censorship. That's where we go back to.
Exactly. The Jonathan Rauch book, by the way, is The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, and that subtitle is really important. I think you said the Constitution of Liberty, which is a Friedrich Hayek book. That's
Hayek.
Yeah, that's Hayek, and those are both worth reading. It's interesting that you made that reference.
Did I just slip of the tongue? Yeah.
No. They're both they're both worth citing, and you cited them both. So, Don, one other question I really wanted to ask you. There's so many, but I really wanted to ask you this: what are the appropriate protections against the limits, the over or excessive limits on free speech? Within government service. So the current administration is trying, and it's not the first, and it's not unique to Trump, but the current administration is very flagrantly trying to limit the ability of those within government from criticizing the president and some of the president's programs.
Right.
How much of that is acceptable? What is the line that should not be crossed? How do we protect the free speech of people in the Justice Department and the Defense Department?
I've been reading about that just in the last few days, I've given some thought to it. It's working in a government, and the whole set of free speech, First Amendment doctrine on that very question. When you work for a company or the government, it's not the same thing as you going out there and expressing your views on something. In terms of its impact on what if your speech completely disrupts the operation of the company or the government. So at one time, and Justice Holmes wrote one of the original opinions on this, if you're a public employee, you have no First Amendment right to speak about the job. But as part of the general liberalization of free speech during the period that Jeremy was talking about, the court developed, it's a 1968 case. The public school teacher published an op-ed in the local paper in Glen Ellen, Illinois, near where I was brought up nearby there. And he criticized the spending policies of the school, too much money on sports. Sound familiar? And he was, I don't remember, I think he was fired or punished anyway. But the court ruled that you are speaking on a matter of public importance, or a matter of public concern is the word they used, as a private employee, but you're speaking as a citizen on a matter of public concern. The First Amendment will apply to you, but in a different way from the way it would if you were not that employee talking about your work. So there's two different levels of First Amendment analysis. One is First Amendment coverage, meaning that you've said something and, okay, you might have a free speech right to say it, but maybe not, but it raises First Amendment concerns and issues. Therefore, it's covered, and then the court applies the appropriate test to see whether or not the First Amendment indeed does protect it. Mm-hmm. Coverage and protection are not the same thing. They often are, but they're not necessarily the same thing. First Amendment, this is the first case, 1968, classic example of that kind of stuff going on at that time in the law. The First Amendment covered him, and it ended up protecting him.
Wow.
And basically what you do is you say the public, you have a right as a citizen to express your views. They don't disappear. Just like in the famous school case, Tinker, Constitution doesn't stop at the schoolyard gates, the court said.
Right.
Well, the Constitution doesn't stop at your government office door. But your right is not as extensive as it would be in a normal case. And basically, they look at the public concern, and then they weigh it with the effect on the office and how you spoke out. This was an op-ed. This was clearly this. If he had done like a memo within the school, it would have been less protected and maybe not protected at all. But he did it in a public forum, and the court has sort of lowered that protection a little bit over the years. The big case involves a assistant district attorney, and he criticized the way they were granting warrants. And the court said that when you're speaking as a citizen, even if what you're saying is pursuant to your official duties or relevant to your official duties, the First Amendment doesn't apply at all. This doesn't even cover it. And that was a famous, it's just the name of the case escapes me. I led the movement in the University of Wisconsin Faculty Senate to explicitly protect professors for criticizing the university. I worked with the university committee, and we submitted it to the Faculty Senate in 2010. And it's the Garcetti case.
Right.
And the University of Wisconsin rules. We had one dissent out of 200 or 150 faculty members that we are allowed to criticize our own university. And usually that means criticizing something we know about, which can tie it to our duties.
Right.
And but the courts have been divided in how they apply that to universities. The reason, though, is that universities are there to encourage. We're different from other kinds of institutions.
Right.
We are there to do the stuff we're talking about tonight.
Yep. There's also, though, to connect this to Zachary's poem, there's also an important role dissent plays even in more focused, more official government institutions.
Absolutely.
So
True.
there's a whole dissent channel in the State Department where someone can file a dissent with the State Department's official policy through official channels.
But that's good to have that. It's very good to have that. But the issue is, as a principle of free speech in a free society, I think that's good and should be what departments do. The Garcetti case, however, the exception that one of the justices, the guy from New England, Souter said there should be an exception for universities because of our special intellectual role. You know, we're not the same thing as like a fire department. We're not better people. A lot of us are a lot worse people than anyone else, than police officers and firefighters. But our institution has a different kind of duty from what they have.
Right.
And that involves dissent, protecting dissent, among other things. Right.
A firefighter can't say he's dissenting from his requirement to go put out the fire.
Yeah,
he has to go put out the fire.
But Souter did not talk about, say, the State Department.
Right.
So I think that's up to them to do it. And I think they should do it.
Right.
But then you've got to be, kind of careful because of the role and what the implications might be for, national security and all that kind of stuff. So, we're just talking basics here.
Sure.
I think it's a good idea to do it. And I don't I think Trump is being authoritarian on this kind of stuff. And it's really, it is a concern. And, the question is, how much does the Constitution require someone to be like FDR was and surround himself with disagreement? Apparently, I had lunch with Charles Lane, before you came here, Jeremy, and he was talking about meeting with Bush and how, Bush invited, this is the second Bush, invited people to disagree with him. I've even heard that about Trump, but I don't know enough to really say that he does like disagreement around him, but it's got to be within within in-house.
He certainly doesn't like public disagreement.
Yeah.
Don, we like to always close when we have a complex issue like this with some tips, ideas, ways in which our listeners can use this to help themselves and help their efforts to protect our democracy. What are the pieces of advice you have, especially for young listeners? What should they be doing to protect free speech in their own lives?
I think the first thing that they should do is learn something basic about it. This is like E.D. Hirsch's notion of cultural literacy. That it's amazing how many things are tolerated because people just don't know any better. And educating themselves as to the foundations of a free society, and so they can put it in context and try to understand the key reasons we protect dissent in the country, because it makes us all smarter, more knowledgeable, and tolerant of each other. If we're intolerant of each other, we're going to have better reasons for not tolerating somebody, at least in terms of morality. So learning the basics, and then get involved with it. Wisconsin, we had marvelous students, especially undergrads, that were part of our movement, and it changed their lives. At least it changed it. I'm not saying how such a big of a way, but it made them feel their strength as citizens, and it gave them a certain kind of confidence in themselves. Katie would be an example that I was talking about. So it's a question of education and knowledge and commitment, and don't just talk at others. Listen.
Right.
Listening. Alexander Meiklejohn said that the First Amendment's primary beneficiary is the listeners. That's why I shouting down speakers is so contrary to the spirit of free thought.
Well said. Well
you
said.
They have a right. They have a right to listen, and that's how you learn.
Yep.
And you're violating the right. You go to a talk and people shout down the speaker, you don't get to hear. And so he says the rights of listeners is really the fulcrum point of it all.
Zachary, does this resonate with you? I mean, as someone on a college campus now, do you see what Don is laying out, educating oneself, getting involved, defending free speech itself as a topic that young people will be drawn to?
Yes, I think so. I think the one saving grace of free speech, as embattled as it might be, is that it's something that everyone who has a dissenting opinion or an unpopular opinion, which is these days probably a lot of college students, feels immediately how important it is. And in that sense, I think there's room for people who disagree vehemently to come together and, at the very least, emphasize how important it is that they listen to each other, and even more so to protect free speech as a principle that we all stand by.
Absolutely. It has to be defended. It's not manna from heaven. And it's up to the faculty. I had the way I taught, and especially when I had this undergrad seminar, I draw my best students into criminal law and jurisprudence. It was a class I died for. And in one class, I had the leading progressive radical on campus.
Yes, I think so. I think
Ron Barrow's son.
The one saving grace of
Barrow's,
free speech,
right?
as embattled as it might be, is that it's something that everyone who has a dissenting opinion or an unpopular opinion, which is
sort of
these days probably a lot of college
leader
students,
of that whole
feels
on campus.
Immediately how important it is.
From Texas.
And in that sense, I think there's room for people who disagree vehemently to come together and, at the very least, emphasize how important
the idea
it
was
is
to get
that they listen to
kids
each
in
other,
there,
and
you create
even more so to protect free speech as a principle that we all stand
to
by.
Thinking through these issues we were dealing with. And you create this common ground of educational pursuit as a community. I always looked at it as a little college within the university. At least that's how I felt about it. And you think about what brings people from different backgrounds and different races, et cetera, together, it's common activity, like people in a play, people working in some sort of business endeavor. They have a common purpose, and that brings them together in terms of purpose. Then they can then they take that with them when they go out. And I think we spend way too much time in higher education. This is the identity politics issue, which right now is being contested so strongly, is that it divides rather than unites. We know it divides us. And there's always going to be a division. That's when the dissent goes into it. It respects people that are different. But we also need sufficient common ground. This goes back to my point about concord and discord. That in order for conflict to prevail in a healthy way, it has to take place in a common ground of concord, where we agree on certain fundamentals and community. And if it takes place without that foundation, I mean, this was Tocqueville too. Tocqueville said American democracy will fail if its civil commitments and communities don't cohere. And we end up getting tyranny of the majority, or we get isolated in excessive individualism. Tocqueville didn't say it, but he might have, someday people are going to go bowling alone. And so that contributes to the silo problem we have. We find community, but we find it is Richard, great book called The Fall of Public Man, in which he compares positive community from negative. Negative community is withdrawing into the kind of solidarity that shuts off the rest of the world.
Right.
And positive community is more liberal in nature, but it still has to maintain elements of community, but it's liberal, it's open-minded. And universities should be that. They need to create a community of common ground, but a special kind, and that is pursuing the truth together, with the leadership of the people that know the best way to, professors who supposedly know more than the students. That's our endeavor, and we've lost sight of that.
Don, I think that's so well said, and you've articulated so beautifully how central free speech is to making community possible. And this connects to Zachary's point about how in dissent we can actually find not an agreement on the substance of policy, but at least a consensus on the need to talk, to share ideas, and to have the right to listen, as you said, as well as to speak. I think this is so essential to democracy and often forgotten. And I'm glad that we can articulate this, understand it, and hopefully think more about it in our daily lives before we try to shout someone down or before we try to cut someone off.
Yeah. I think it takes constructive leadership to help point the way there.
That's right. That's right. I think that's a perfect note to close on. Don, thank you so much for sharing your lifelong wisdom on this with us. Really, thank you, Don.
I enjoyed it. I probably talked too much.
Not at all.
Hope you didn't get too tied up in First Amendment, doctrine. That's, I think I tried, especially toward the end, to get it into more.
Absolutely. No, and actually, in a podcast episode on free speech, you should speak a lot, and we should listen a lot, and we did. Zachary, thank you for your scene-setting poem and for your excellent input. Thank you most of all to our loyal listeners and readers of our Substack newsletter for joining this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week.
You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
See you next time.